Good morning. We're just giving people a second or two to enter into this room where we're going to get our session started in about 30 seconds or so. So we're just going to wait. I don't have any jokes, unfortunately, that roll off my tongue at 7:30 in the morning, but luckily we will be engaged in a very interesting conversation, so those won't be required, which is great. My name's Stephanie Robertson, and I am the co-chair of the Social Value Matters 2020 conference that's been running from Toronto and from London, England, but joined by people from all over the world for the last 3 days. This is the fourth. And what we are completely amazed by is that our conference actually started at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, and it has continued. So while this is day 4 for me, the conference has been running around the clock because of the breadth of the social value movement and also the offerings of members in 43 countries and people like the experts that we have here today who are going to talk to us about measuring the value of the public investment in arts and culture. I'm going to turn it over to Jen Snowball, who is our moderator today. I'm going to wish you well. I'm going to look forward to listening and watching, and I'll join you at the very end to say thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and we appreciate this this opportunity to get together and have this very interesting conversation. So as you saw from the slide, the title of this panel is Measuring the Value of the Public Investment in Arts and Culture, Approaches, Challenges, and Opportunities. And we've got an interesting and I think very experienced panel of practitioners together today to talk about those things. The COVID-19 crisis, I think, has highlighted for people all over the world the important values associated with arts and culture, which includes their economic value, but also their social and intrinsic value. And so this panel is really focused on how cultural value can be measured and expressed so that it can feed into effective evidence-based public investment in arts and culture. So I'll just briefly introduce our panel members because they'll say a little bit more about themselves in the first comment. Our idea is to have about 45 minutes of panel discussion, but we will be taking questions at the end, so we're hoping to leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end. So if you think of questions as we're going along, please feel free to add them to the chat bar, and then we'll also invite you to just ask them at the end if you'd like to just raise your hand and then unmute yourself, and then you can ask the question. But if you think of them as you go along, please feel free to just add them to the chat bar. I appreciate it's very early for people on the sort of western side of the world. It's about lunchtime in South Africa, and it's probably quite late at night time in Australia. So we'll give you an opportunity to wake up first before we ask you what else you'd like to discuss. Okay, so on our panel, first I'd like to introduce Mr. Gabriel Zamfir Enusch, and he is the Director of Research, Measurement and Data Analytics at the Canada Council for the Arts. Previously, he worked as the Manager, Research and Performance Measurement, and the Administrator and Finance Director of the Biennale of Montreal. So you can see he's had lots of experience in different capacities. He also deals with corporate and project management, with business strategy, research and reporting, strategic data analysis, and performance measurement. Gabriel's interested in professional research and analysis related to economic and social values related to the arts. Welcome, Gabe. Our second panelist is Mr. Sunil Iyengar, who is the Director of the Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts in the US. Welcome, Sunil. His office produces, I'm sure, as we know, research reports, hosts periodic research events and webinars, develops strategic plans for the agency, and establishes research and data partnerships with other important US associations like the US Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. His office also conducts program evaluations and performance measurement for arts endowments. With his team, he's founded a national data repository for the arts and launched 2 awards programs for arts researchers, and he chairs the Federal Interagency Task Force on the Arts and Human Development. So welcome, Sunil. Okay, and then our third panelist is Rebecca Mostyn, who is based in Australia. She's the Director of Research and Knowledge Management at the Australia Council for the Arts, which is the Australian government's arts funding and advisory body. Rebecca oversees the delivery of in-house and commissioned research and evaluation work, including reports such as National Arts Participation Survey and Macquarie University's economic study of professional artists. Prior to joining the Australian Council in 2016, Rebecca was manager and research strategist at Screen Australia, where she managed data collection and analysis and delivered projects including Seeing Ourselves, Reflections on Diversity in TV Drama. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you.
And I've just realized that I haven't really introduced myself, so let me do that quickly. My name is Jen Snowball, and I'm based at a small university in South Africa called Rhodes University, and I'm also the Chief Research Strategist for the South African Cultural Observatory, which is a publicly funded research organization that produces policy and industry relevant research about the cultural and creative industries and the cultural sector. So welcome everybody. As you can see, we've got a very diverse and interesting panel today. We've got 3 sort of main areas that we would like to discuss. The first one is kind of broad and also gives people an opportunity to talk about the work of their own organizations. So we know that arts and culture have all kinds of different values for citizens, but how do we measure that value and express it and share it with people who are decision makers or with people who pay taxes, which might lead to the public investment in the arts? So where is your organization positioned in the discussion about the value for the arts, and how should we do this going forward? So I'd like to start off with Gabriel, please, if you could give us some thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Jen. Hello, everyone. And I will start with thank you to Social Value Canada for organizing this session. It's a great opportunity for us as funders to talk about our work, and very important about our contribution to knowledge mobilization in the art sector, and demonstrate the value of the public investment in the arts. Before talking about Canada Council, I think also it's a great opportunity for us as a group. Rebecca and Sunil and myself are part of an international research group created a year ago with colleagues from New Zealand, Australia, UK, and the United States, that allow us to contribute to share knowledge among us and other arts players in our country. So it's a great opportunity again for us to be together today. A great question, Jen. Before I would like to say a few words about the Canada Council, because it's important to understand its role in the art ecology in Canada. So Canada Council for the Arts is Canada's public funders, contributes as organization, arts agency of the federal government, contributes to vibrancy of a creative and diverse arts and literary scene, and supports the presence across Canada and international of the artists, Canadian artists. Canada Council has an increasing important role to play within our democracy. And I think this aspect is really important because confer us a role to be open and progressive in our social mission. The Council civic role means invite, support, and make heard other artistic voices to join those we already support for many years. And of course, we must continue to encourage. It's a support that reflects in the current context in Canada, self-determination and cultural sovereignty. That allow us to be more reflective of the Canadian context and society. We talk about the fact that arts and culture have a value for citizens. It's true, but very complex to talk about and even more to demonstrate. I think the value of art and culture is an addition of variety of experience. And that means it's an addition of diverse expression. So as organizations, the council have responsibility to support the cultural right to people to have access and to participate in arts and culture. What we are measure when you talk about arts and culture? It's not a single answer because we are not measuring a finite object. It's a variety of experience, so that gives more complexity to our measurement. Also, I think the value of the arts should never be confused with the value of our sector, because in that context, we talk about culture broadly, about culture and creative industries and heritage. Understanding the value of the arts as a sum of values and experience is a commitment to openness, equity, inclusion, and next generation. Our tools and methodologies that we want to put in place are not neutral, and we have to talk today in Canada about new approaches to measure the value of the arts in a context of decolonize our measures and approaches. Often our research methodologies are rooted in European or European approaches, so we have to take a larger approach that, as I said, respect self-determination and sovereignty. A few facts about Canada Council. In 2016, we undertook a large-scale transformation, a movement to make our programs more inclusive and empowering. We broke the silos of 146 programs isolated by discipline rooted in Western European vision of artistic practice, and we create 6 outcomes-based programs. Outcomes-based focus on results and impact of our programs. Why we are measuring it's important to overcome a persistent illusion that the data on the value of the arts has a marginal impact on political decision to support arts and culture sector. I truly believe that the data that we collect, the work that we do as researchers, facilitate the decision making in the context of market economy, make the government accountable of managing the public funds, and also contribute to the social to general understanding of the social value of the arts. As a council to work to demonstrate and report on measures that we put in place, we created we took the approach of integrated reporting model that combine outputs, outcomes, a qualitative impact. I know for many of us seems technical. Outputs is number of grants we receive. Outcomes is what is the value of our programs for those who receive the grants and how our grants contribute to their artistic work, career development, and public participation. And qualitative impact are referring to intrinsic value of the arts for Canadians. More details about our approaches and our project I'll provide during this discussion. So I want to close saying valuing the arts means valuing different arts experience, valuing different people experience using enjoying the arts, and considering diversity of our artistic voices.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Gabe. You've raised a whole lot of interesting points there. Just to remind our participants, if you think of comments or you want to ask questions as we go along, please feel free to fill them in the chat bar. Sunil, over to you. How can you tell us a little bit about what your organization does and where they are situated in terms of talking about the value of the arts?
Great, happy to do that. And thank you all for this opportunity. It's great to be with you, Jen and Gabriel and Rebecca and others. So the National Endowment for the Arts is really the nation in the US, the lead federal agency supporting arts and culture. Now, it's not necessarily the largest amount of dollars going toward arts and culture in the US, but what one of the benefits of being a federal agency, of course, is the ability to distribute far and wide. And so, you know, our budgets have hovered, I think, in the range of $140 to $160 million a year, which, you know, if you look at the total pie of arts and cultural funding in the US through philanthropy, particularly private philanthropy, through state and local public agencies, some of which, of course, comes from the Arts Endowment funds, or through commercial funders, you know, you realize that it is, after all, you know, a relatively modest amount of the total investment in public facing arts and culture in the US. I do think, though, that there's some unique advantages that also have some implications for measurement and valuing about arts and culture and how we go about it. So, you know, essentially the way the Arts Endowment works is, you know, just as most philanthropic and certainly federal or national arts councils and funders, we have, you know, a kind of peer review system of grant application review process. It's very based solely on excellence and merit, but of course there are various sub-criteria about those qualities. And one of the things that's important to realize is, you know, our funding goes to project support. It's not for operational support. It's not necessarily even for artists directly, because we don't have that ability legislatively. We're actually in our 55th year this year, so we just celebrated an anniversary of sorts. And in terms of the funding, one of the things we do, you know, there's a leveraging effect we find when we fund arts and culture in the US. Oftentimes that can, you know, that the assurance of a grant from the NEA means that there can be more fundraising, there can be more dollars brought to bear on that project throughout the US across the various artistic disciplines that we support. And so when I talked about the reach or mentioned it, you know, one of the benefits, as I said, of being situated federally is this ability, of course, to reach into pretty much every community with our limited funding. So in fact, the distribution of those funds, of course, is based on excellence and merit, but because of the outreach and our attempt to reach into all kinds of segments of the community, urban and rural, different, you know, demographic subgroups within the population to really, you know, celebrate and their sort of forms of expression and to really validate, in a sense, through funding, a lot of the cultural traditions and artistic expression that is going on there through grant making. Because of that, I think that it creates a very interesting public-private de facto partnership where, because of our investment, there is additional support brought in through the public sector. And so we have that ability to steer the ship, but certainly provide incentives towards funding that's going to be more equitable and reach more Americans around the country, regardless of their background or origin. I said that as an elaborate preface to just quickly explain where we are as an agency in terms of valuing this work and arts and culture essentially. And I really liked what Gabriel said about the distinction between you know, the artistic experience and sort of, you know, valuing arts and culture as a phenomenon versus thinking about the arts sector, not necessarily putting them at odds, but recognizing there's different measurement questions and different ways of thinking about arts and culture, not monolithically by any means. So what we do now as part of our strategic plan, essentially it's embedded in our work, is that for the last several years, promoting and publicizing knowledge about the value and impact of the arts for individuals and communities is really at the center of our mission, alongside the sort of more fundamental grant-making nature of our work in supporting artistic expression, creativity, and community engagement in the arts. So what that means is where we are in that, I think we're a pretty loud voice at the table for that. Hopefully not a, hopefully very, certainly a very accommodating voice, and very, a voice that, we listen, of course, and integrating evidence as well as, what's going on at the time into the ways we formulate our research questions. But essentially, when I say what it's the fact that the Arts Endowment can actually be at the table when we talk about social value, can be a flashpoint for understanding social value in the arts in the U.S. Because there really isn't a other than the Arts Endowment and some other federal agencies that may have the arts in their portfolios, but it's certainly not front and center, even though they may be much larger agencies and departments. There's no cultural ministry, for example. So our attempt to really interrogate questions about the value and impact, it becomes very important for even a relatively small agency like ours to be very vocal about that and to work in an agile way, take advantage of that strength and work with other partners in the government and outside the government to study some of these issues. And so for individuals versus communities, I will just quickly say that we have grants programs, research grants programs that really support investigations into the value and impact of the arts using a variety of methods, research methods and approaches. And one of the things that we found valuable throughout the years is really reaching out into other sectors. So not being limited to, say, those who study arts and culture full time, but going into other domains and adjacent domains, whether it's education, health, or community development, psychology, social sciences are a big ally in our work. So in that process, we've made some interesting partners along the way, and then very helpful partners in not in infiltrating where the arts and culture are in these other sectors. And I think that's the point I would close on, is because the arts are so woven, deeply woven in the fabric of, I think, all of our lives, of course, but even in fact, in the operations of programs and organizations, and it's sometimes hard to kind of put a light on it. So we really essentially strive to make the invisible visible through research about the arts. And I think that's the message I would lead on.
Great, thank you. Yes, I think that's a great way of talking about some of the work that we do to make the invisible visible. Now I'd like to invite Rebecca from the Australia Council for the Arts. Rebecca, welcome. Please tell us a little bit about what the Australia Council for the Arts does and how they're situated in terms of thinking about arts and value and social value.
Thank you, Jen, and hello everyone. It's good to meet you all. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that I'm joining you from today, the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and also acknowledge any First Nations people joining the conversation today. As Jen mentioned, I'm the Director of Research at the Australia Council for the Arts, which is the Australian Government's arts funding and advisory body, and similar to the Canada Council and the NEA, it's a grant giving organisation, and we also have legislated functions around providing advice to government and undertaking research and a whole lot of other things as well. And increasing awareness of the public value of the arts is well within the Council's mandate, both from a research perspective and a broader advocacy perspective. So that's in our legislated functions. And it's also one of the Council's current priorities set out in our corporate plan. It's been highlighted as one of 4 pillars. So how do we measure and share the value of arts and culture for citizens? Over the years, various methodologies have been used in Australian studies by academics and consulting companies and lots of other parties. And I'm sure they're very similar to studies that have been done in other countries as well, using the kind of the Holden framework of intrinsic, instrumental and institutional value through to things like consumer surplus or consumer choice or time use value and those other kinds of methods of putting financial value on non-financial benefits. I thought probably what I would do is just run through a few examples of the types of projects we've been doing recently at the Australia Council that are specifically examining the public value of the arts. So we have a central piece of research in this area, which is our National Arts Participation Survey, and we've been doing that for over 10 years. So every 3 years or so, we take a bit of a temperature check with a representative sample of the population about all types of engagement with the arts and attitudes to the arts. And I'm sure that's not very different to the kind of regular benchmarking that's done in many other countries. And we published our most recent results just a few weeks ago. And in addition to the fact that nearly every Australian engages with the arts in some way, 3 overarching themes emerged around the value of the arts through that process of asking the public directly. The first was that the arts and creativity are going to play a central role in Australia's future success, with increasing recognition of contributions to child development, education, local businesses and skills for the future. So similar to what Sunil was saying, we do have that view of how the arts interacts with other areas of policy and society and government priorities. The second theme that came out, it reinforced the role of arts and creativity in building social cohesion. And the third was the contribution to health and well-being. And separate to this survey, we know that there's this growing body of research around the world that points to the benefits of the arts and creativity to helping meet some of those challenges such as ageing and loneliness and chronic conditions and mental health. And people may have seen recently the World Health Organization published a review of the evidence on the role of the arts in improving health and well-being. So what our latest survey results were telling us is that the Australian public is increasingly recognising what these other specialist studies have been showing, that the arts can have a big impact on health and well-being. So that's, again, another focus of our research, looking at those relationships between the arts and other priorities of government and society. And we're launching a new piece of research in a few weeks, which is another example of the way we're looking at these questions. It comes out of a partnership with the Sydney Opera House, and it's examining their program for embedding creativity in schools. So this research aimed to understand that particular program in 2 ways. Firstly, as a case study documenting and evaluating that program against its objectives. And secondly, as a kind of thematic case study, exploring what we can learn from the program in a wider context, the public value of arts and creativity in education, as well as changing business models for cultural organisations and the role of creativity and creative capabilities in future workforces. And one other example of the type of work that we do in this area is actually an evaluation of one of the Australia Council's own programs, and it's delivered by our First Nations Department. It's a program that aims to ensure the passing on of artistic and cultural knowledge from older generations through to younger generations. And one of the key components of this program, it's called Chosen, is that First Nations artists and communities determine the program design and the delivery and the evaluation, and that's to ensure that successful intergenerational transfer. So the evaluation of this program, which is still underway, it's drawing on program materials and a survey of participants. But I think this project is one that really shows the power of a case study in communicating value, because some of the stories of kind of exponential outcomes that are coming out of this program have been quite incredible. We've mapped the timelines of a few of the projects showing the various knock-on effects for the people involved, across the original communities, and then out into other communities and even nationally and internationally in some cases. So sometimes I think we find that telling those individual stories can be one of the most powerful and effective ways of sharing the value of arts and culture for individuals and communities. And just to finish, the sharing part in your question, Jen, is obviously vital, and similar to what Sunil was saying, there's a whole lot of activity that goes into communicating our research findings out to the arts sector and to the media and government and beyond, and mobilising the arts community to use the research and share it out to their networks, because, you know, we build the evidence base not just to have the evidence, but to increase awareness and to I guess to affect some change. So that's really important.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks for those interesting examples as well. I agree with you. Sometimes case studies can sort of really speak very loudly, especially if they're sort of embedded in data. And that kind of leads us into the second question, which I had, which was really around whether you think that there are changes in the way that societies, but also funders, public funders in particular, governments, are seeing the value of the arts as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, and maybe also as a result of a change in sort of political affiliations in many countries. And then obviously that's going to feed into what do we value, right? So in terms of how things like outputs and outcomes and impacts that Gabe was talking about earlier, it feeds into how those things are defined and measured. And I think what everyone alluded to is who benefits, right? It's not at all a neutral kind of thing, and what kinds of new methods we might be using to value those. I know that's a sort of complicated issue, but firstly, just to talk about whether you think that what societies and funders are valuing in the arts has shifted, either as a result of the COVID crisis or some other political shift in your country, and then how that might impact on the kind of work and funding that your organizations do. I'm going to ask Sunil if he'll lead off with this one, please.
Oh, thanks. Well, Rebecca's a really great answer to that first question reminded me that just to think about a sort of baseline or where we started before COVID. I mean, we too, as a cultural agency, the National Endowment for the Arts, had been investing a lot of our research into arts participation, who participates in the arts, how do they participate in the arts, through national surveys of the kind mentioned. We also have, and this has a social dimension, of course, but it doesn't lead with the social value, which is the economic value when we talk about measuring the arts as a contribution to GDP and arts and cultural production. So those were kind of our standard statistical resources at working with other agencies, whether it's the US Census Bureau or the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the US, to track kind of descriptive statistics about how people engage with the arts. So with COVID, I think what it's done is it's underscored two things for me anyway, from a research vantage point. One is sticking with those descriptive statistics. I think there's a much more deeper understanding of the need to understand who's benefiting, as you say. So issues of equity and really the population characteristics of those who engage with the arts are as important as ever now, when so many people are deprived from participating in the arts in formal settings, for example, or in public settings because of social isolation and other things. And then on the economics front, it's not only about, hey, look at how great the value, the impact of the arts is in the US, which has been a real lead. I say it's really the leading point that has been made, I think, in the last several years, and when certainly in advocacy, but in talking about the value of the arts overall, therefore alighting a lot of the really important social and not necessarily in conflict with, but some of the social and emotional and some of the other and health related and well-being benefits that have been associated with the arts over time. So what I'm saying here is that on the one hand, we're recognizing that it's not, besides just reporting statistics about the arts, we need to dig deeper into who's benefiting and how. And that the second piece is it does shore up a body of work that we've been doing anyway, and my colleagues have been doing, and others, as I alluded to, arts and health. But I would say in general, trauma-related recovery and the arts. So if you look at, this is an area that hadn't been studied that much, but disaster relief. I know there's natural disasters, and then there's, of course, these kinds of things. There's the pandemic and we had civil unrest, racial killings and issues related to that, that also created a really frenzied year to think about, how does this realign what we do, and how do we think about measuring arts and culture? So trauma and thinking about trauma came up in my mind just now because, we do work, for example, with the U.S. military, looking at how military service people and their families and veterans, how they, if they engage in creative arts activities, and particularly creative arts therapies, how that improves their outcomes, particularly related to psychological illnesses and trauma-related injuries. And even in that one limited scope, in that context, we're seeing a lot of findings that I think are relatable in a time of COVID or in a time of social and civic unrest. So I think a lot of the work around arts education research, a lot of the work around kind of social emotional learning and social emotional well-being, I think can be accentuated in this time, and we may want to think about doubling down on that kind of work as we go forward to know how people have been recovering as individuals from this crisis, and how they've been coping emotionally and in every other way. There's also, of course, the public health aspect of the arts being used in public health, which we won't get into here, but that's another thing that can be studied with regard to social value in this time of COVID. But then the other thing, just going back to the equity issue and thinking about who's benefiting, understanding that certain populations are disproportionately affected, just as they are by COVID. There's certain populations that, of course, have not had access, have not been engaged with the arts historically, or engaged with, let's say, resources to support arts and cultural expression and creativity. So I think we want to understand those limitations and barriers better. And so through our research, I think, and with our partners, trying to understand that. And I'll just give one example of what this looks like. So we've worked with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the US and some other funders to support work around understanding how the arts relates to social cohesion and health equity. Those are two different but related concepts, and what place-based arts programs and interventions can contribute to social cohesion, and also to communities, members of that community participating in healthcare and participating in conversations about health. So it's been a really interesting project. We hope to release a report later this year, or rather our partners will. So I mean, I've kind of covered a waterfront, and I don't know if I've been terribly specific, but I'm just trying to give you a flavor for how this is we're starting to percolate with this material.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That was very interesting. Rebecca, have you seen any kind of changes, any of these kind of changes as a result of what's happening in the world at the moment, in terms of how governments and societies are understanding kind of more social value of the arts and who benefits from that?
Yeah, and I'd probably just start by kind of echoing most of what Sunil just talked about. So yeah, it's interesting. So before the pandemic hit, we had this horrific season of bushfires during our summer, which and I know that's happening in the Northern Hemisphere as well at the moment. And so what we saw was a real mobilisation of the arts sector in response to the fires. Many artists being among the first to give their time and skills for fundraising and raising a lot of money, and also sort of seeing that sense of the role the arts can play in disaster recovery and rebuilding communities through things like bringing people together to process those events, and even practical things like supporting tourism once they get up and running again. So we do have some research showing the role of the arts in supporting tourism outside major cities, which is where in Australia where most of the areas that were most affected by the fires. And also in Australia, similar, there are organisations that work specifically with communities in creative recovery and in preparedness and response to natural disasters. So that's definitely kind of in our what we're thinking about as well. And I guess, yeah, we've seen some more of those examples in the context of COVID, with things like all the, the balcony choirs and the online dance parties and people sharing the stuff they've been making at home during the lockdowns. And even, as Sunil said, that kind of processing that sense of isolation and loneliness that comes along with that. And we do have some research that with audiences around the value of the arts and engaging with with others through the arts during that period. And I think that understanding and articulating this type of value will be an ongoing focus. And another area I think is becoming more prominent, and again I think Sunil also talked about this, was around social cohesion, and the arts have always been that space for difficult conversations and for sharing different points of view and for challenging assumptions. And at this kind of moment in history where we're more connected than ever, but there's also this increasing polarization, that role of the arts in generating empathy is arguably becoming more important and more kind of obvious in some ways, because that sharing of stories is a really powerful way for people to navigate viewpoints and experiences that might be different to their own, and a way to engage with complexity and challenging ideas from a comparatively safe space of a book or a play or a song or whatever. And another area, again already touched on, is accessibility. So who's missing out, who's underrepresented, and if we're kind of understanding all of these benefits that the arts bring, then who is missing out on those benefits? And we do have some work underway in Australia looking at how socioeconomic inequalities interact with arts engagement. And we know that there's still a lot of work to do in ensuring that the voices of First Nations Australians and people of diverse cultural background and people with disability are represented through the arts, and all those groups are able to engage with the arts as well. So that's another piece of work and another focus area for us, and a concern, I guess, for the sector. Excuse me, more broadly. I do have one more point.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just going to mention. Maybe we should go to Gab. I'll come back.
Okay, let's come back. Let's come back to you, Rebecca. Thanks. I'm really interested in what you're talking about, access, issues of access and participation. And I mean, coming from South Africa, we've had one of the longest and I think most I don't want to use the word draconian, but the strictest, right, lockdowns, has been the emphasis of the whole digital divide as well, so who has access to online and who doesn't. Gabe, can we come to you? Can you talk to us about what's been happening in Canada? Have you seen some shifts in how people are looking at the value of the arts and who benefits from that?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. It's a challenging moment for all of us, because we have to reposition ourselves and also our methods of work, and our projects are coming up. Before I respond to the question in this context, I think it's important to, as my colleagues mentioned, what is the role of our section as researcher and evaluation and measurement, which is really important to support the Canada Council in taking decisions based on evidence, contribute to knowledge mobilization in the sector, and it was very well presented by Rebecca, the importance that how we communicate our work and how we share that knowledge outside the sector, especially in this context. And of course, the third part of our mandate is demonstrate the public value of the art, of the public investment in the art in this new context, where the government invests or put more money to support the sector during this pandemic. As I mentioned at the beginning, talking about experience, the value of arts constantly change according to the needs of the society, communities, and individuals. It's influenced by artistic creation, particularly by everything that echoes the emerging trends, underlining and driving change, and setting the pace for social progress. So in the current context, it's important to keep in mind the baseline, as Sunil mentioned, the way that we report before. But during the COVID-19 crisis, many artists have given online access to their creation. We noticed the arts are a crucial universal needs, and they are a heart of all our aspects of life and communities. The value of the art, in my opinion, will be more tangible if we reimagine better conditions for artist creation, dissemination, and their remuneration. If we reimagine more resilient, inclusive art organizations, if we imagine an art sector determined to eliminate racism and discrimination in every form and the legacy of the colonialism. And of course, very important in this context, and unfortunately, we have a bad example from Australia, what happened last year with the fires. It's if we imagine to art a greener and more just and equitable world. So the arts and culture now can play a more social role and contribute to a beneficial collaboration with other sectors. And we have many examples of arts collaborating, artists, organization, collaboration in health, digital entrepreneurship, community, and international collaboration. I truly believe that art is a pillar of sustainable development because we need art is more relevant than ever. Talking about the council experience in this changing context, I think priorities in our measurement and reporting on the value of the art should be put in the context of impact of digital and new technology in the art sector. In very interesting concept of decapitalization of the internet or internet of the community. So going back to the community and reflect those communities. And I think our research agenda is impacted for many years from now is to understand the impact of COVID-19, how this pandemic affected the art sector, and how as public institution we can support the sector in the recovery. So as a council, we start looking at different innovative way to collect data, quantitative and qualitative, to measure the impact of COVID. We are at the beginning because it's hard. We are in the phase of observation. It's time to see what happened around us, to develop methods that inform the government and also support the art sector during the pandemic. So we are looking to the direct impact of the crisis on the art sector. Impact economic and financial is very important, and the data shows that it's a huge impact on the sector. The employment, artistic programming, and the way that the artists present their work nationally, international, and of course, the social impact and civic impact. In relationship with this direct impact, it's a complete indirect aspect of the measurement that is related to the relationship between arts and other sectors such as health, tourism, education. It's very important to see how in the recovery phase, the tourism and the arts can work together in rebuilding the community arts experience and support the artists from communities.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Gabe. That's a very, very interesting, useful addition. I know we said we were going to talk about collaborations a bit more, but I'm quite keen to open it up to some questions now, if the rest of the panelists are okay with that. So we've got about 10 minutes And there have been some very interesting things going on in the chat if you've been following it. And one of them is, well, what is cultural value, and does it actually change from one country to another? And how do you know whether what you think of as cultural value is actually what other people think of as cultural value? And I was interested to hear Gabe there talking about going back to the communities and trying to sort of maybe change a little bit the Western ideas, if you like, of what is valuable, or even what is culture. Would any of our panelists like to speak to that a bit, about the sort of contextual issues around defining cultural value and what is valuable? It's an easy question. Come on.
Again, I would offer, I mean, I think it's really interesting that some of the things that we're talking about are quite similar, and we found that in our discussions as well that we've been having over the last year or so, that and with our colleagues in the UK and New Zealand as well, that there are a lot of similar concerns and themes around access, around kind of equity, around diversity, although our cultural contexts are quite different. All of our countries have very different sort of cultural profiles, but these issues are still, they're similar issues in all of our countries. I'm sure there are very specific situations for each country, and for in Australia, obviously, being the home of the oldest continuing living culture in the world, you know, the way we think about First Nations, our First Nations arts and culture, and the way First Nations culture is it's just a part of life. It's not some sort of something that, oh yes, the arts are a very nice thing to have if you can kind of, if you've got a little bit extra for them, it's integrated into life. So I'm sure there are some distinctions as well. But the thing I was actually going to say before I got that horrible coughing fit, sorry, was there was I just thought people might be interested to know that an independent think tank here in Australia recently analysed cultural policies globally over the last 70 years. And they identified 4 policy drivers that were kind of common themes that came up looking at all of those cultural policies. And they were collective identity, reputation building, social improvement, and economic contribution. So it's interesting, I suppose, that, yeah, similar but different.
Yeah. I mean, I must say, listening to you all talking from very, very different contexts compared to South Africa, I'm kind of having that same feeling. Oh, yes, these are issues that we're struggling with or dealing with, or kind of values that we're facing up to as well. Sunil, do you want to come in here? Maybe just
Sure.
share some thoughts on how the US system works, or how?
Well, I think, yeah, and I see a comment about that report. Rebecca, that would be great to see that report link if you have it. Not necessarily now. I think that's that independent think tank report you mentioned. Yeah, I think in general, this kind of, again, to us, it shows some limitations that we've had in really understanding arts and cultural participation, even in the US. And we take a lot of pride, I think rightfully, in our statistical apparatus as a nation, in really understanding how people engage with different arts activities, culturally, et cetera. But I think, it again reinforces the need to maybe do more qualitative studies, and whether it's ethnographic or, certainly understand from the, in the way that Gabriel was implying, I think, what do communities, even if they don't call it arts and culture, what kinds of forms of expression, what cultural traditions, but also what forms of innovation and artistic, what we would, conveniently put the term artistic around. Now, clearly there has to be some standardization, and there has to be some way to create a measure for the purpose of research here. And so I actually threw it in the chat box, a link to a report that came out of a collaboration with the UK, actually, when they were doing something called the Cultural Value Project, where we really tried to interrogate how to, given the way we currently measure, in the US anyway, measure arts and cultural value through our surveys, or not value, but just arts and culture as a phenomenon and participation, how can we start to open the aperture wider and get at other forms of participation? And this seems coincidental, or it seems to co-occur with what we've been talking about in terms of technology. So on the one hand, yes, we need more robust qualitative studies to maybe create an even richer theory of change and a kind of conceptual framework about arts and culture that is not just imposed by, whether it's Eurocentric or any particular tradition. But we also need to really take advantage of, in a way, and be more sophisticated in using organic data. So data that is, ways in which people express their preferences online and through technology, and the ways in which so many companies, I think we'd agree, have become savvy, and maybe not always in the best of senses, in terms of mining that data for marketing purposes, et cetera. But as public funders, I think we need to understand better, for example, crowdfunding and other ways people engage with the arts online. And again, not necessarily considering themselves artists or participating in arts and culture with that label. And then use that data to generate a better, maybe, framework for measuring arts. Now, this is very aspirational. It's not something we're going to do tomorrow necessarily, but I'm thinking that's the only way I think we can have put more dynamism into the current measurement structure, which is right now rooted in forms that have been certainly fixed because there's certain, or rather elements that are very popular and have been historically prevalent in certain art forms. Like we can name the 4 or 5 top, ways in which people engage in arts as we know it. But there's also, of course, organizations and institutions and programming and grants that have been supporting those various forms. And so we want to sort of understand independent of these operating structures and organizations, what are the ways in which people really do engage with the arts.
Yeah. Thanks, Sunil. I'm glad you mentioned the funding aspect or dimension there, because I was very interested in you saying that, the National Endowment for the Arts, they may not have the biggest funding pot, but it's a very important way of leveraging other funding, or it's a way of getting some kind of validation for what you're doing. And I mean, what we're talking about in terms of understanding kinds of value and also measurements, of course, has very real implications for funding, doesn't it? So it has the way that we're expressing these things and measuring them and reporting on them really does have a kind of on the ground impact as well. Gabe, can I come to you for a sort of a final comment on some of these things? I know it's kind of an impossible job to wrap it all up in kind of 3 minutes, but give it a shot. Tell us your thoughts around these kind of issues around value and funding and access.
Absolutely, and very interesting discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have time to continue more. So I will do my best to put for a very important aspect that I think we have to consider more and more in the context of culture, value, and I saw one of the questions on community and relationship between big institutions and artists. I think from research point of view, we have to acknowledge that mostly the majority of our methodologies and approaches are often grounded in European worldviews. So maybe it's the time that we step and say, let's change our approach vis-a-vis indigenous artists and arts communities, be more respectful and mindful in the relationship with other equity groups, and change the ways that we collect the data, we interpret and we present the data that is relevant to them. It speaks their voices and it reflects their communities. I think it is a time that as funders we have to recognize the self-determination and sovereignty of indigenous people and the different voices at the table in the arts community. It's a lesson learned after this pandemic. As of October 1st, is the change that in our approaches to do research I think I have an impact for the years to come.
Great. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd just like to thank you, Jen and Sunil and Rebecca and Gabe. That was an amazing conversation, and you touched upon so many issues that are fundamental, not only to measuring and valuing the arts, but also why the arts are such an important thing in all of our lives. I'm not sure whether or not we communicated this before the session, but the vision for the social value movement is to change the way the world accounts for value, meaning how we value social and environmental things differently. There's many people that believe that we need a new form of capitalism that doesn't, so that our lives are not so dominated on financial return. And I maybe Kate, who is our expert technical support person here, will put into the chat box the URL for Imperative 21, which is a new global movement to try to bring attention to the need to change the way that the world is prioritizing things. And what they have done is they have mobilized the power of art to bring some really important concepts to people's attention in a visual format. And the thing which so inspired me about the words and the thoughts and the work that you've just shared is in this art-based campaign, they have done what you have said is so critical in terms of presenting these concepts in a more universal, more grounded way that all of us can see ourselves within. And I just wanted to say, you know, thank you so much for giving us some ideas about how we can engage in the work that you're